Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. And we'd like to start off by inviting everybody to come to the Left Forum in New York City this coming weekend on Sunday, the 9th of June, at the Left Forum, which will be in Pace University. I think that's Park Row, across from City Hall in Lower Manhattan, at noon Sunday, the 9th of June. And one of the panels of this very large event, this is the continuation of the old Socialist Scholars Conference of the 1960s, which was revived some years ago, and it has probably 1,000 to 1,500 speakers in hundreds and hundreds of panels. But anyway, one of them will include yours truly. So that will once again be Sunday, the 9th of June at noon. The week from now. It's the week at the Sunday at the end of the week in which this broadcast will be heard. And do come along. One of the topics, of course, is what do we do, since this is the Left Forum, what do we do with a pro-war left? What do we do with a pro-austerity left? People who run around talking about energy austerity and carbon taxes and other really oppressive measures that would crush the living standards of working people, but somehow these so-called leftists are in favor of it. And it's a largely anti-labor left wing, whatever else we can say about it. So that will be, I think, an occasion of some interest. And unfortunately, there is admission charge. This is not within my ability to influence, but for those who are looking for an exchange of views, this would be the moment. Now, we are in the midst of the battle on student loans. 10 days ago, the reactionary Republicans in the House of Representatives passed their odious Klein bill, which raises the interest rates, and it raises them with an adjustable rate note. That is to say, the federal Stafford loan, instead of having an interest rate locked in, it becomes an adjustable rate, just like an adjustable rate mortgage. Isn't that wonderful? We've had such a great time, so successful with adjustable rate mortgages, because the Republicans want to make everything subject to the market, and that is exactly the point. The education of the younger generation is too important to be left to the vagaries and the uncertainties of the market. It's got to be guaranteed, and markets guarantee absolutely nothing except corruption, manipulation. Remember the LIBOR scandal in London. We still haven't really gotten to the bottom of that. 17 zombie banks colluding, conspiring over years with the knowledge of the U.S. and British governments, who knew but did nothing. Bernanke knew and said nothing. And people were ripped off, and some of those lawsuits are going through the courts. So that's the market. Monopolies, oligopolies, duopolies, trusts, and so forth. And that's what these Republicans want to bring in. Now, what we have to hope for is that Obama, from his own instinct of self-preservation, will make good on his promise to veto this. If this ever reaches him, he's got to veto it. And today, Friday, the 31st of May, we did have a Rose Garden photo op and event with Obama coming forward and calling on the Congress, first of all, to prevent the scheduled doubling of the federal Stafford loan. Remember the one that Ron Paul voted for? That was little Ron's thank you. The leprechaun thanked his devoted followers, the duped, pathetic college students who supported him. Some did. he thanked them by saying, let's double the interest rate on you, kiddies, because that's the Austrian school. So today Obama appears with a dozen or so students behind him and talks about the interest rate, which will go from 3.4% to 6.8% on new Stafford loans issued after July 1st. So Obama says higher education cannot be a luxury for a privileged few. That's exactly what the Republicans want. They say back to the 1920s where college is reserved for the rich. And all of their arguments really are a cover, a cloak for that. And Obama talks about his own story with student loans. Only 9 years ago, Obama and Michelle paid off their student loans, which cost more than his mortgage. We won't get into that on his lot that he bought from Resco. We'll leave that one alone. That's all written up in Obama, the Postmodern Coup, The Making of a Manchurian Candidate, and Barack H. Obama, the unauthorized biography, where he said that was a boneheaded financing deal. Yeah, it was, Obama. But anyway, you know, getting Obama impeached or indicted or whatever, that won't do anything. Better to force him to do things in his somewhat weakened condition. So Obama in 2012 campaigned in not letting the interest rate double, and now he says he wants to put through his method, which is it's not quite as bad as the Republicans, but it's no bargain, and it's the rate on the 10-year Treasury note plus about 1%. So right now it would be about 3%. So if it's 3.4%, it would just about stay the same, give or take a few points. Obama might be slightly less than what it is now, but then it might go up. The difference with Obama is that once you've bought the loan, then you've locked in the rate. So the Republicans are going with the Klein proposal. We'll talk about this in a minute. Obama says the House bill isn't smart and isn't fair, and Klein eliminates safeguards for lower-income families. Several Democrats have offered their own plans. Hey, how about hearing about the Elizabeth Warren and John Tierney bill? Not mentioned here in this wire service article. So Mitch McConnell says, these are just a few points. It doesn't really matter. Here's what McConnell says, right, the plutocrat. With the president and congressional Republicans in agreement on the need to provide a permanent reform to address the increase in interest rates on new student loans, no one should be fooled by today's campaign-style event at the White House. House Republicans have already passed legislation which would prevent a rate hike. That's a lie. And Senate Republicans have proposed a solution similar to the one Obama himself called for in this year's budget. Here's one issue where the two parties can and should find quick agreement. No, because the platform the American people want is the Elizabeth Warren plan, 0.75% interest rate. And who's financing that? The Federal Reserve System, for the first time in decades and decades, is being forced to cough up the credit, cheap, subsidized federal lending, not federal spending, not federal borrowing, not federal taxation, but federal lending using the inherent credit-creating power of the Federal Reserve System for the public good. That thing called the general welfare that I do find twice in the Constitution, which no Austrian has ever been able to explain to me. They always tell me what it doesn't mean, but they can't tell me what it does mean. And then we have Boehner. He says, these differences are so small. The difference between 0.75 and 8.5 is a hefty difference. So it's time to fight for Warren, Tierney, and brush aside these reactionary Republicans who are on the defensive on this issue, as you can hear from McConnell's verbiage. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, the May 31st, 2013 edition. And a reminder, please come to my speaking engagement in New York City at the Left Forum, New York City, Lower Manhattan, Pace University, Park Row, across from City Hall. This will be Sunday, the 9th of June, from noon to 2 a panel, and then, of course, it can go on in other forums. That would be a panel at the Left Forum, and it will be a strategic briefing on a number of issues. Part of it, of course, is the need to sweep aside the discredited, tired and discredited so-called leadership of Noam Chomsky. I think he'll be speaking at this event, and other left liberals who have failed. They have struck out, and it's time to push them aside. Right? Whatever their merits are, they belong in the past, and now we have a new perspective. We'll be talking about that in this program. The new 1936, which is not a household concept yet, but it may well become one. So the immediate focus remains in the waning time now of the academic year, but with some commencements still destined to go on, the Warren-Tierney bill. And the Republicans, I think, are at least rhetorically running scared. We just heard from McConnell in the Senate, and Boehner in the House says the differences are so small, with time so short, and the differences between our proposals so slight. Today's event was misguided. This is Obama's Rose Garden event. Deeply disappointing. A president who promised young people who would reject petty partisanship today practiced it himself. If he really wants to shield students from higher rates, he should work with his former colleagues in the Senate and act. That's what our students deserve. Now, the problem with the Republicans, and this is a severe problem for them, they cannot defend, they cannot justify this Klein bill in the specific terms of what it means to be a student and the amount you have to pay and student loan burdens and everything concrete. The more specific you get, the more they're lost. And I talked about this last week when they had the debate on the House floor. We had this reactionary old battle axe, Virginia Fox, Republican woman from North Carolina, and she really couldn't defend anything about this bill. She just had to fall back on spouting this sort of standard Republican boilerplate Chamber of Commerce rhetoric, get government out of the way, get politicians out of our lives, let the American people go to work, and then everything will be fine, and small government and cut taxes and all this stuff. But still, this doesn't explain why should the interest rate be able to go up to 8.5, and why can't you at least lock in a rate where you know what you're going to be paying? And we heard this again now this morning. This was a pathetic example, and we want to cite it because it did, at least the Warren bill finally got mentioned, although with very little detail. This is MSNBC this morning, 9 to 10 a.m. Luke Russert, right, the successor, who inherited his father's job. I guess that's how he got there. So he's interviewing Congressman Luke Messer, M-E-S-S-E-R. Mackie Messer, the knife. Mac the knife. So here's Luke the knife. Luke Messer, Congressman, Republican from Indiana. And the question to him is, why should anybody support your bill when the interest rates are likely to go high and can go up to 8.5%, and isn't adjustable rate a bad deal? So the first thing he says is, the Democrats are trying to change the subject. He says they're experts in diversion. They're trying to get us wrapped up in some debate about a few percentage points of interest. Yeah, this can be quite a big difference if you've got 100,000 of student loans. And he says, this Republican congressman says, everybody knows the real issue here is Benghazi. It was unbelievable. Benghazi is the real issue, and this is, of course, what the I guess the American Enterprise Institute, or was it Heritage? One of those had put out this thing saying, don't make any specific concrete proposals. Just fall back on scandals. IRS, right? Koch didn't get his tax exempt status fast enough, and then Benghazi, which is a complete fraud, until you grill Petraeus and Carter Ham. So the problem for the Republicans is this student loan one. They can't avoid it because the interest rate is going to go up. And if it does go up, this is one of the things that could, I think, ultimately endanger the Republican hold on the House, right? If you could get the students absolutely clear that the Republicans were essentially trying to destroy their future with these high interest rates, that is something that could factor in to a change in the House the next time around, because students, if you can get them to come out, they do count for some. Problem is you can't get them very often to come out. So Congressman Messer says Benghazi is the real issue, and he says, you're really misleading these kids, right? The issue for them is not just a few points on their loans, but can we have a job for them, and could the economy be brought back? And of course, what the Republicans mean by that is to cut taxes on the rich and to cut the services of government. He says, this Republican congressman, the debt limit is coming up, and the debt limit is a big deal because a lot of Republicans think it's immoral to spend borrowed money. Right? Boy, they must have had a Damascus Road conversion sometime in the end of 2008 or the beginning of 2009. And he wants to go on that the Medicare system will be bankrupt by 2023, and they want to force Obama to the table on tax reform and so forth. But you see, none of it is a direct justification of why the interest rate should be so high. And this Russert at least had the decency to ask him, why should the interest rate be higher? And then Russert did bring up the Elizabeth Warren plan. This is actually a sign of progress because MSNBC, their standard coverage, simply leaves it out. So what about that? And what about the idea of giving the interest rate of the banks, right, the 0.75 discount window that a bank can get if it can't get anything else, and why not extend that to students? And essentially just evasive action, right, dodging away, scuttling away, the two-step, the three-step. So I think the Republicans are in some distress, right? The ability to nail them on this, it's one of the few issues where the Republicans are actually being forced to come out with specifics and try to defend them. And what you see is that they just don't defend them. They can't defend them. So there is going to be more attention to this. There's some kind of a conference call, I think, of MoveOn.org at the beginning of next week. If people are registered to that, please get on it and do what you can to beat the drum for the Warren-Tierney bill and demand a really uncompromising mobilization on that. And for those of you who listen to the Diane Rehm Show on National Pentagon Radio, if you go to the Diane Rehm Show website, you'll see that she's going to have a program about that. That is a call-in show. I urge you to be ready to call in and to illustrate what I think does exist, that informed public opinion is a groundswell in favor of Warren-Tierney 0.75% interest rate. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, the May 31st edition. Once again, Tarpley, part of a panel at the Left Forum, Pace University, New York City, at noon on Sunday, the 9th of June. That's this coming weekend. Wide-ranging strategic discussion. So, as I said, call into that Diane Rehm program, right? Let her hear what the groundswell of support is in the population, that these interest rates can very well be 0.75%. And remember, the point with this is it's not going to be paid for by borrowing. It's not going to be paid for by taxation. This is precisely the Federal Reserve that's going to pay for it, right? Bernanke is going to pay. All right, now switching our topic to Syria. The situation continues to sharpen, looking actually more and more like the Spanish Civil War, although maybe the outcome this time might be different. Russia remains strongly on the side of the Assad regime and stability and resistance to the death squads and these Nusra al-Qaeda rebels. Right? Russia has a strong interest in this because the victory by the al-Qaeda forces in Syria would then be translated into another upsurge by similar Al-Qaeda types, probably the same people, who would then be shipped into Chechnya and put themselves under the command of this Doku Umarov. So the news this morning is that at least 10 MiG-29s are likely to be sold to the Assad government. Now, that would be interesting because that would seemingly be a new contract, not a pre-existing one, but a new one. Russia feels, of course, free to do this because the British and the French, the discredited Suez Coalition of 1956, the discredited and hated Sykes-Picot imperialists of World War I, they have broken the European arms embargo, right? And this was 25 countries to 2. This was the British and the French, the Colonel Blimp imperialists on the British side, and the Vichysois nostalgics, right? The nostalgics of Marshal Pétain on the French side. They have broken the embargo and say that they will, at some point, want to ship weapons. But the others, of course, Austria, Czech Republic, Netherlands, Sweden, against it, and the whole group was actually against it. It's just that without the unanimity, the thing broke down. So it's really not that the European Union voted to end the embargo, it's that the sabotage and wrecking operation by the British and the French proved unstoppable. So Russia's getting set to send 10 MiGs. The Russians have concentrated significant part of their surface fleets from the Far East, from the Northern Fleet, from the Baltic, and elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Russians have shipped in these Yakonsk, very powerful, very capable anti-ship cruise missiles. The S-300P, very advanced air defense system, is it's either there, according to Assad, or will be there soon. What have we? We're noticing that Israeli spokesmen are whistling in the dark, right? They're protesting too much. They say, oh, well, we can defeat that. We have standoff missiles. We have other things. Well, maybe we'll find out whether it's so easy to defeat that. And maybe it won't be so easy to defeat it. And maybe some planes will go down. Remember, when you're dealing with air attacks, it's the rate of attrition, right? If you lose 3% or 4% for every sortie, right, out of 100, right, then that's going to add up quite fast, attrition. So the Russians are also pressing for the Geneva conference with the presence of Iran, with the presence of Assad. Now, the death squads, actually, these are not the death squads. These are the lounge lizards. The lounge lizards love to meet in five-star hotels. They've been living high on the hog, or high on the sheep, I guess, in this case. So they have been living the life of Riley in these hotels around the world. And, of course, they represent absolutely nothing. And in case there was any doubt about it, the rebels, one of the death squad commanders, had sent a message in the last couple of days saying to the world, look, those guys in Istanbul don't represent us. We won't follow their orders. We have nothing to do with them. They are nothing. But in any case, the death squad frontmen, the Syrian National Coalition, as it calls itself now, can't agree on anything. That guy Khatib gave up. We have this character Hitto. He doesn't seem to have lasted very long. So the word from Istanbul is that the Syrian National Coalition won't go to the Geneva Peace Conference. So they can't agree on anything, except that they want to stay in five-star hotels. They also can't agree on including the, what can we call it, secular to Christian but anti-Assad forces of Michel Kilo. Michel Kilo had gone to Moscow and had been vetted there, and they found him wanting, but he's still operating, and I think he wanted 40 seats, and they offered him 6, and that was not good enough. Now, let us just list very briefly the wonderful qualities of these rebels. They're guilty of cannibalism. One often thought in these Istanbul hotels, well, if you guys can't agree, why don't you try cannibalism as a solution, right? That seems to be the coming thing. Cannibalism, summary execution. We have films of a dozen or a smaller group of 3 or 4 Syrian soldiers who are being executed. That is a Nuremberg crime. For that, the Nuremberg noose is waiting for the people who did that. kidnapping United Nations peacekeepers, especially from the Philippines, on the Golan Heights. The Austrians are also on the Golan, and they say to the British and French, look here, if you become parties to this conflict by openly arming those death squads, then the Austrian forces cannot stay as peacekeepers on the Golan. The use of chemical weapons, we have two cases now. We have one case where Carla Del Ponte of the United Nations says the death squad terrorist Nusra Qaeda rebels use chemical weapons. And now we have a Nusra unit caught on Turkish territory with poison gas, with chemical weapons. How interesting that the breastfeeding and the tub-thumping of the NATO aggressors and their Israeli auxiliaries, how interesting that this has died down now that it's clear that the death squads are the ones using this stuff. The U.S. is not interested. Oh, and then, of course, killing journalists, killing women. How about killing a woman journalist, right? This the correspondent of Al-Ikhbariyah television, Syrian pro-government television channel, killed by a sniper. And this just goes on and on. This is the negation of civilization. This is the war of all against all. When Hobbes wrote about bellum omnium contra omnes, he was thinking of the Syrian rebels. They kill each other. They fight among themselves. Half of their effort, easily, is killing each other. The siege of Qusair goes on. It looks to me like the place has been enveloped. It is encircled. This is now a battle of annihilation. The fighters that are caught inside are not going to make it, right? This is what we, in Second World War, was eine Kesselschlacht, right? This is a Kessel. This is a battle of encirclement. It's a pocket which is now being reduced, and that takes a while, but it's inexorable. And, of course, if the rebels are stupid enough militarily to think that what you want to do is to send more death squads into the pocket, then they will inevitably be wiped out as well. So that is the current situation regarding Syria. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, the 31st of May. So a couple of more notes concerning this Syria situation. Hollande is now reminding us more and more of these so-called socialists that were essentially responsible for running the Indochina War and the war in Algeria. I guess it was, Guy Mollet or somebody like this, right? The people who engaged in the Suez Adventure of 1956. Hollande is now back to that. We have an interview of Hollande this morning where he says, how could you expect the rebels to accept Assad remaining in power? Well, that's exactly the issue of the negotiations, Hollande, right? And who appointed these death squads to be the arbiter of the future of Syria? Who appointed a bunch of bearded death squad killers to be the deciders of the future of this country, and that their wishes are somehow automatically going to be fulfilled? We have to issue a solemn warning to Cameron and Hague of Britain, to Hollande and Fabius of France. Any Americans who die in commercial airliners or other such vehicles whose deaths are brought about by surface-to-air missiles supplied by this bankrupt British-French Suez, Sykes-Picot, Colonel Blimp, Vichy, Pétain Confederation, they will be personally responsible, and that is then a war crime. Man pads. Don't give man pads to those killers, or you may be left holding the bag. The sharp contrast, we had the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva this week. Sharp contrast, a decent international civil servant, Carla Del Ponte, pointing out that it was the rebels who are most likely to have used poison gas. This Navi Pillai, this is not an international civil servant. She distinguished herself already as a warmonger and an imperialist stooge in regard to Libya, and now she's doing it again with Syria, right? That Navi Pillay, as all of these Orwellian double thinkers, anybody gets killed in Syria, it's the fault of Assad. And, of course, that's what Hollande says, too, that if you get killed, it's going to be Assad's fault, right? Because he could have given up, right? But then look at the chaos, right? And look what it's going to mean. Emirates, microstates, mini-states, rump states, warlords, chaos, the breakdown of civilization, bellum omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all. And then McCain, the warmonger, the obsessive McCain, obviously bearing some kind of guilt, something that he did in the prison camp, the fact that he seems to be implicated in shooting off this rocket, the hot start that seems to have blown up a U.S. aircraft carrier off Vietnam, something to do with his betrayal of the POW MIAs in Vietnam, for which he became an enforcer for Nixon and others. McCain slips into Syria and cavorts with the terrorist leadership on the ground. And unfortunately for him, McCain goes in to meet General Salim Idris, the well-known CIA golden boy. There's been about a 4 to 6 week CIA world press campaign to accredit this Idris as some kind of a leader. But unfortunately, at the meeting in the background, we see the face of a terrorist kidnapper, somebody who is on record. He helped to kidnap Shiite pilgrims, held them. That's of course a war crime in itself, right? Kidnapping civilians, holding them, threatening to kill them. McCain is happy to meet with kidnappers and terrorists and so forth. Isn't it time for McCain to be indicted? If Holder wants to relieve the pressure on himself on things which are, by comparison, not anywhere near as important. We don't really care whether the Koch brothers got their tax-exempt status so that they could finance their filthy reactionary Tea Party organizations. We don't care about that. Those tax-exempt grants should never have been made. There are other ones that should not have been made either, but we're not going to get riled up about this. But why doesn't Holder impanel a grand jury and indict McCain, since a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich, indict McCain for giving material support to terrorists, because the people that he met with can be documented. We have one case already, the kidnapper. Look at some of the other ones he met, and look at them, and that traces back then to Al-Qaeda and various, it can be Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria. And there's probably also an indictment against McCain for violating the Logan Act, that he is making foreign policy and he has no such legal ability. So McCain has gone way out on a limb, and this is just, it really is amazing. And he's going to tell you that the issue is the IRS. No, I think the issue for McCain is likely to be material support for terrorism. And remember the bottom line, most recent poll, 66% of the American people are sick of war, had enough of war. 2/3 of the American people say, no thanks. Take your warmongering someplace else. Now, changing gears, right? We're going to go into our second hour in a minute. Let's just look at some of our issues of austerity, right? And I would point to, a couple of things, right? The Emanuel brothers, let's just take care of them. Isn't this amazing? We've got the Emanuel brothers attacking civilization on two fronts. We've got Rahm Emanuel as mayor of Chicago, who is determined not only to bust the teachers' union, but to close a large number of Chicago public schools. And in doing this, of course, he's following the Arnie Duncan Obama line, right? This is what Obama was doing when he was the head of that Chicago Annenberg Challenge. Bust the teachers' union and then break up the school system, privatize it, wreck it. And the two main threats to education are privatization and this obsessive testing. But let's also not forget, we've got Ezekiel Emanuel, Ram's brother, is active here in the Washington, D.C. area. There is a new method of treating cancer. It is called proton therapy. I think proton beam therapy, very promising for various kinds of cancers, but inevitably, at the beginning of its application, rather expensive. Ezekiel Emanuel is described as up in arms. Who's paying this guy? Is that all he's got to do? Why doesn't he get a life? Obviously, somebody's paying him to be up in arms, right? Some austerity ghoul operation. And he's out there saying that there should not be 2 proton therapy centers established in the Washington, D.C. area. One of them is going to be at Sibley Hospital here in the District of Columbia, and one other. The argument is, oh, well, it's too expensive. It's not worth it. And, of course, there's one in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins University. Yes, but that's quite a ways away. And if it works, we want it. This is the way you actually save money, is by taking the most modern treatments that can become cures. And with that, you can save money without violating the Nuremberg Code. So I'm afraid that these 2 brothers have exposed themselves as definitely antithetical to most concepts of civilization. The other thing that's going on in the background, here's another area where the reactionary Republicans are being forced to get specific. That is the Farm Bill, and particularly the SNAP, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, food stamps. This is 50 million Americans live on this. It's about $1.50, give or take, per person per meal. And the Republicans are planning to cut $20 billion out of this over the current fiscal year, the coming fiscal year, 13 to 14, FY14. They want to cut this, and this has got to be stopped. We'll have a few more things about this in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. It's May 31st, 2013. Do stop by Pace University, New York City, this coming Sunday, the 9th of June at about noon. Panel with yours truly in the context of the Left Forum, which is a large event. Admission is charged, but there is then the ability to take a look at quite a few differing speakers, right? About 1,000 to 1,500 of them, I believe. So, the Hunger in America story is that the Republicans are determined to carry out literally killer cuts, genocidal cuts in the food stamp budget, and the Democrats are essentially inclined to go along with at least part of it. And this has now been pointed up. The focus is on this because of a new report. The International Human Rights Clinic at the New York University School of Law, this is entitled Nourishing Change, Fulfilling the Right to Food in the United States. And it is a right. It's not yet in the Constitution, but it is undoubtedly a right and was recognized as a right by Franklin D. Roosevelt in the Economic Bill of Rights, the freedom from want provision of the Atlantic Charter in the State of the Union Address, January 1944. In other words, defeat fascism on the battlefield, and one of the benefits, in addition to the GI Bill, owning a home, going to college, is the right not to starve. That sounds quite radical, I guess, to some of these Republicans. So, 50 million people on food stamps, 17 million of them are children. Food security radically increased, of course, because of the depression and similar problems. So focus on food insecurity. And, of course, if those cuts go through, 2 million people will be pitched into the area of acute food insecurity, that is to say, possible starvation. And that is barbaric. And that is not within the realm of acceptable discourse. Krugman, in today's New York Times, also tries to defend the food stamp program. He cites Moody's Analytics that every dollar spent by food stamps, SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, increases the GDP by $1.70. So you practically have it, to some significant degree, it pays for itself through increased tax revenue. The Republicans determined to pitch $20 million into the outer darkness. There's also the question of the WIC, Women, Infants, Children cuts that have been implemented under this genocidal sequester program. And the article from Krugman, however, concludes that this is, of course, it's a moral and political outrage. He says, this is the time to get really, really angry. All right, Krugman, I'm really, really angry, but it's not enough just to sit here and be really, really angry and think bad thoughts and maybe call names or do something like this that Wall Street and Republicans and the Koch brothers and the rest of this. How about we do the Wall Street sales tax and we make the big zombie banks and hedge fund hyenas pay for food stamps with a 1% Wall Street sales tax on Wall Street turnover? We suppress speculation at the same time. Krugman, you should be for this. You should be putting it in your column. Keynes is for it. Keynes explicitly supports a tax on stock turnover and financial speculation. And then I would add the one that Keynes doesn't seem to have understood, the need to nationalize the central bank. This with Keynes, he's not there. He's too much a part of the central bank world himself to understand that this is outrageous. We wish to nationalize the Fed, as much of it as we can at any given time. And right now, the obvious vehicle is the Warren-Tierney bill. And Krugman, I wonder, where's your column supporting strong support for Warren Tierney? Your friend Stiglitz is in favor of it. So isn't it time to mobilize? And we will get sometime today the word from the Social Security trustees about the viability, the amount of money that's in the trust fund for Social Security on the one hand and Medicare on the other. And this will come down to a number of years, right, until the money theoretically is gone. But look, don't accept any of that because the answer is the Wall Street sales tax. And if there's not enough money, it's because Wall Street is paying nothing. So here's an interesting one. Medicare has, in a year that's gone by, Medicare has gotten farther away from exhausting the money in the trust fund. So we're told that as of last year, it was expected that the Medicare trust fund would be exhausted in 2024, but now, despite the fact that a year has gone by, it's 2026. So Medicare is fine until 2026, 13 years. Plenty of time to enact the Wall Street sales tax, make the zombie banks and the hedge fund hyenas pay to prolong the program, and defeat Peter Peterson of Lehman Brothers and his crackpot Institute of Economics, right, the austerity ghoul faction. And Social Security, their fund at the Social Security is valid until 2023. So on that one, of course, Obama is guilty of undermining the longevity. He wanted to get an easy stimulus, and that was this demagogic piece of idiocy and criminality of cutting the Social Security payroll tax so that he could get the Republicans to agree with it, because it was a way of putting a nail in the coffin of Social Security. So Obama could look good and say he was putting money into your pocket, but he forgot to tell you that he was doing it by destroying your pension that you're going to rely on later in life. So 2024 to 2033, plenty of time for the Wall Street sales tax. And, of course, plenty of time to nationalize pieces, more and more, and ultimately the entire Federal Reserve nationalized, deprivatized, federalized, seized, what have you, in order to finance a recovery. Make Helicopter Ben finance your college loans. Make Helicopter Ben finance your mortgage so you don't get foreclosed on. Make Helicopter Ben cough up to finance the rebuilding of Superstorm Sandy victim states, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. That Oklahoma City case, tragedy out there. Make Helicopter Ben cough up. Same thing for other places. So that is the austerity front. Now, concerning austerity, this gets us into our perspective here in the second hour. We're looking at the question of a new 1935 to 1936. We're trying to look into the future, talked about this briefly last time, to try to see if we can learn from the parallels of the last Depression and the sort of the repertoire of themes of the last Depression, right? Strictly avoiding any mechanistic applications, or at least trying to, but trying to get an idea of what might come next. And one of the things we can certainly say is, in Europe, the credibility of austerity is way down. We just had a meeting of the European Commission this week, and what we found is that these gangsters, these criminals like Barroso and Olli Rehn, can't ride the full genocidal austerity attack that they wanted to. They're having to pull back. They're having to make cosmetic changes, minor alleviations, minor adjustments, and this may have an implication for mass struggle. That's our topic in the next segment. The perspective for the coming years, right? And the guide is, generally speaking, the last Depression, the time from 1929 to 1935-36. It's about 6 to 7 years, and it's the distance between the first deflationary panic crash, in those days it was the crash of 1929, and a mass strike upsurge. In other words, a sharp left turn, certainly we can call it, but a mass strike upsurge, and what the potentials are and the lessons that can be drawn. Compared to that, we are now, we will be next year, 6 years into the Depression. That is to say, 2014 is 6 years after 2008. And then, of course, then 2015 is the 7th year of the Depression. And unless, of course, recovery programs are implemented, that depression will continue. This depression will continue to go on. What I'm trying to point to, though, right now is the European Union basically says to these different countries, you have more years, you can take longer to reduce your debt. We don't want you to increase the austerity quite as much. They're facing this unemployment catastrophe across the European Union. It is now 23.5% unemployment for people under 25 years of age. If it's Greece or Spain, it's 50%. Even places that are supposedly prosperous, like Germany, Austria, 8% youth unemployment. That's an awful lot. So there's it's not a fundamental policy change. It's a cosmetic change. It's really just a kind of Delphic trick to keep austerity going, but to slow the pace and to, for the moment, take evasive action so that you're not causing some kind of an immediate explosion. But what we can see from history is the moment where there's a breathing space, that is when working people may then decide to fight back and to mobilize. The other thing is this interesting story about the Reinhardt-Rogoff quackademic research, right? These are two Harvard professors, I believe. They put out this stuff about the amount of debt you have in a country, public debt, government debt, compared to the growth rate, and they claimed that they could show that if you had a lot of debt, your growth rate would go down, and this then became an argument in favor of genocidal austerity. Their data has now been shown to be flawed, fudged, whatever it is. The exposure of the Reinhardt-Rogoff quackademic duo is, to some degree, I think, an attempt in this country also to fight back against austerity, to say essentially, you have no theoretical basis. You have these two fraudulent researchers that didn't live up to their standard in the research design. Okay, now let's try to go through this. I first of all urge you take a look at Tarpley.net. There is a write-up of this. So nobody's been able to get out of the depression. Japan is now doing this high-risk competitive devaluation racket that could lead to panic at any point. Iceland, of course, not a success story. Living standard cut by 1/2. They're not happy. So go back. We will just simplify it. Right? We won't do all the intermediate stages. But 1929, the crash reaches bottom. 1933, that's a period of right turn, right? Nazi seizure of power, and so forth. But then in 1935, 1936, you get the beginnings of an upturn. It means, however, that you've gone through a period of pretty bad stuff. Germany, Italy, Portugal, Austria, all fascist by 1934. Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Balkans in general, military or civilian dictatorships, fascists in England under Sir Oswald Mosley. And this interesting moment we talked about, France, the monarchists, the reactionaries, and fascists coming up with an armed assault on the Chamber of Deputies, February 6, 1934. That would have been the march here on July 4th, but the word now is that Kokesh has backed down and is calling for marches in 50 state capitals, which I would think is going to go off like a wet firecracker. But in 1934, remember that attack on the Chamber of Deputies was enough to bring about the fall of the Daladier government, the coming of Doumergue, and get Marshal Pétain, the top French fascist, into the government. So the idea then is 1935, 36, we get an upsurge. And this has three components at that time, right? The first is February 1936, the Spanish Popular Front, the socialists and communists get together. Even the anarchists are convinced to stop their usual sabotage operations and join in. And that led to a government which could have carried out a land reform and implemented workers' rights. Unfortunately, then in July of that year, the fascist Franco comes with his army from North Africa with a coup d'etat, and the Spanish Civil War begins. Now, the question then is, was the strategy and program adequate to win the Civil War? The answer is no. Reasons for that will be forthcoming. However, in France, around the same time, the same sort of idea. The socialists and the communists and the radical party finally decide they're impressed by Hitler's seizure of power. They're terrified. They get together. So in May and June of 1935, they begin to score successes. And in 1936, in May, they win the elections, and the French workers then go out and occupy every factory in the country. And they do win some demands: 40-hour week with no reduction of pay, 2 weeks paid vacation, end to unrestrained hire and fire policies, which we have in the U.S. today, wage increases. The socialists wanted the nationalization of the Bank of France, but the communists, vainly hoping that the French bourgeoisie would support Stalin, said, no, we won't make them angry. We won't do that. That's a big lesson. Get control of the central bank or you will face defeat. And that's for all those leftists who just don't have anything much to say about the question of the Federal Reserve. In the U.S. in 1936 is basically two things. Number one, the sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan by the United Auto Workers, end of 1936 into 1937. Fisher Body Plant, Flint. Roosevelt refuses to send in federal troops as strikebreakers. So in February 1937, General Motors has to recognize the UAW as the collective bargaining agent for the workers. The UAW goes from 30,000 members to 100,000 members. By the end of 1938, it's 500,000 members in the UAW. The labor movement can reconstruct itself pretty much out of nowhere anytime. And you also have the Remington Rand strike, one in April 1937. So, one more element than that. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So 1936, we've just gotten 36-37. The UAW wins at General Motors. United Steelworkers trying to get organized. The United States Steel is so afraid that their factories are going to be occupied too that they preemptively say, okay, we give in. The Steelworkers Union can represent our workers, and then the Remington Rand strike is also won. And all of this then is the prelude to Roosevelt's most radical campaign, the 1936 one, which rides a wave of sit-down strikes and other labor actions. He comes into Madison Square Garden at the end of the campaign, and he says, government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They're unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred. And the place went wild. So what you have to understand from this is the necessary synergy. The election campaign and the strike and the mass action and the street demonstration. This then gives rise to a very large number of labor struggles, 47 sit-down strikes in March 37, 170 sit-down strikes April 1937, 52 sit-down strikes in May 1937, Chrysler plants, hotels, lumber yards, meatpacking, laundries, department stores. Everybody occupies their workplace and get their union recognized. This could happen at any time. Don't give up. People may lie down and play dead for decades, and then all of a sudden it's intolerable, and they come back. So what are the things we can see right now? First of all, anytime a regime is defeated in foreign policy adventure, that stimulates people to rebel on the inside. Example, 1905 Russia, Tsarist government in war with Japan, humiliating defeat. That creates the Russian Revolution of 1905. The Tsar is weak. We can take him. Let's have a go at the Tsar. Same story here. If the death squads in Syria are wiped out, if the NATO, U.S., Israeli position in Syria collapses, at that point, get ready for a strike wave in Europe and to some extent in the United States. We've also got to watch Putin. This is now the key to supporting Syria, right? We're still looking for that backdoor deal that the Boiling Toads told us about. Still haven't seen it. Haven't seen any démenti from them either. But Putin and the BRICS are offering resistance, and the BRICS Development Bank, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is an alternative to the International Monetary Fund. They need to go into Egypt and essentially kick NATO and the U.S. out by offering a better deal. I would stress very much the role of Pope Francis, the Argentine Pope. Here's a Pope from the favelas of Buenos Aires, the slum neighborhoods. This is a huge polemic against the power of money. He says money has to serve, money cannot rule. He's against austerity policies. He's against plutocracy, against the International Monetary Fund, European Central Bank. All of that is mortal sin, according to Francis. So he's working on an encyclical letter. This will reassert a militant Catholic social doctrine against neoliberalism, monetarism, globalization, and that, I think, will increase the level of struggle, especially in Latin America, especially in Southern Europe. Right, the entire theoretical justification of the recent decades will be wiped away. In the United States, we've got the younger generation under $1.1 trillion of student loans. The Republicans say they want to jack that up, the interest rate up to 8.5%. In theory, Obama a little bit less, but not a whole lot less. And the struggle then for the Elizabeth Warren Tierney bill, 0.75%, 90% less interest. And you can see the hysteria of the Washington Post. They are, of course, the house organ of the Federal Reserve System. In Greece, the reactionary Samaras and his new democracy regime, brutal austerity, their days may be numbered. So that also may lead to new elections. And if Syriza wins those elections, that would then focus international attention once again on the important positive qualities of Syriza. Beppe Grillo this week is in a psychotic meltdown. He's totally discredited. It's very interesting. Let me just quickly cite an old veteran of the P2 Lodge, what they call a faccendiere, an operative, I guess, Luigi Bisignani, member of the P2 Lodge. He says, look, Grillo is created, supported, run by CIA, State Department, Soros, and Goldman Sachs. Why? To destroy the euro and to wreck the European Union, because that's the Anglo-American policy. Now, I would say there's a bunch of petty bourgeois professors in Germany who don't seem to be able to figure this out, that the attack on the euro comes from the U.S. and the British in the name of the dollar and the pound, and they want to destroy the euro. And therefore, what you've got to do is fight on two fronts. One front is to take over the European Central Bank, issue credit to create 40 million plus new jobs in infrastructure and other areas, but at the same time fight against the destabilization of the euro. That's a little bit more complicated than the sort of idiot populist slogans these people have been spreading. There's a new thing called Alternative für Deutschland. This is the petty bourgeois, the Spießbürgerliche opposition to the euro, right? Legal cranks who will always tell you that it's illegal, but they won't tell you how to get out of a depression. And indeed, these people can't see beyond the euro to the fact that there is a world depression. And if you get out of the euro, you're still going to be in the world depression, but they won't deal with that, right? And actually, your ability to fight the world depression is less once you get out. Once the euro is destroyed. Nigel Farage of the UK Independence Party, similar snake oil salesman. You can look at other things, right? There are any number of other factors that might begin to play a role in this. But now the question is hegemony. Who will determine the mode that you go into when this upsurge arrives? Is it going to be the continuation of Occupy, where you're occupying for nothing and you have no demands and anarchists run the show? No, that won't work. Can it be Noam Chomsky, an anarchist, the situationist of Adbusters? No. You've got to have organization, leadership, program, and strategy. Specifically, see beyond the euro to see the world depression if you're in Europe. International organizing is essential. The European Central Bank is an international institution. You can't fight that country by country. You can't fight that Italy only, Germany only, France only. It's just elementary. How dumb can you get? Unity of action, right? In those days, it's the socialists and the communists and the anarchists, if you like. Today, it is more like Syriza. You've got to get a dozen different components in each country or something like that, depending on the country, together. So some kind of unity of action. So that's the United Front against austerity here in the United States. You've got to seize control of the central bank, and that means the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, and the Bank of England, if you expect to get anywhere over there. There has to be a clear anti-austerity line. No carbon tax, no cuts in standard of living, no cuts in entitlements, right? Not for the Socialist International, not for the European Commission. No way. You've got to use elections and mass action. You cannot be under the control of anarchists. And look at this, Grillo, Farage, the Alternativa, and the Green parties. They're all discredited, at least in their current mode, although pieces of these can be then recuperated. And watch out for the libertarians, because you see where that stuff leads. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. In our last segment here, looking forward to this left forum. One of the speakers will be Oliver Stone and his historian sidekick, a guy called Kutznick from American University. And we've just been looking at this Untold Story, the series from Showtime Television. There are some positive features. It is good to highlight the heroism of the Soviet Union. in World War II. We would always say here that the defense of the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany is the greatest military achievement in human history, and the gratitude of the American people to the Soviets, Russian people, is eternal, and we honor it right now. And we honor it in the dealings with somebody like Putin. I wonder if Kutsnik does. I'm not sure that he does. In any case, to go beyond this to adulation actually detracts from the authority of the overall argument. It simply will not do to say, oh, the Hitler-Stalin pact, the crushing of Hungary, the Prague coup, the Berlin blockade, the Cuban Missile Crisis, all of these, somehow we can understand the Soviets and why they did it. I would even add the 1983 nuclear alert, right, which got us close to World War III. At the same time, it's good to highlight somebody like Henry Wallace and the role of Sidney Hillman and Philip Murray. At the same time, we have to ask, how was this defeated? Did Wallace make mistakes? And in particular, what was the role of British intelligence in this? And this, I guess, gets us right to one of the principal problems of this. The overall series is deeply disappointing, and I'm not blaming Oliver Stone. He's a movie maker. I'm blaming Kutsnik. So afraid of being a conspiracy theorist that what he gives you is essentially the establishment version of history with the signs inverted. It's typical of people who are in the kind of William Appleman Williams or even Howard Zinn traditions that this should be so. What is missing in this is the heroism of Franklin D. Roosevelt. The overall series pays very little attention to domestic policy. Therefore, the radicalism and the heroism of the New Deal is hardly included. And what is left out? There's nothing about the attempt to assassinate Roosevelt in 1933 in Florida. There's nothing about the 1934 to 35 Morgan coup. There is nothing about the 1937 planned coup of Van Horn Mosley. Nothing about the 1942 coup planned by von Syatsky and his Russian emigres, Russian Nazis. And nothing then about the poisoning, the assassination of Roosevelt between 1933 and 1945, which is some combination of the Russian woman painter and the British security coordination of Sir William Stevenson, the man called Intrepid. There's none of this. Rather, what we seem to have is a grudging acceptance of Roosevelt. The positive stuff seems to be transferred over to Wallace. The problem is Roosevelt was the guy who had to take responsibility for winning and make those compromises, because that's what it came down to. Remember, the U.S. government after June of 1940 was a coalition government with Republicans in the government, and this gets us to one of the grave weaknesses. This series attempts to rehabilitate Colonel Henry Stimson, General George Marshall, by extension, Robert Lovett and John J. McCloy. The Stimson-Marshall clique in the War Department is one of the main forces of evil. I will be showing in some months now the role that they had in bringing on Pearl Harbor. They are up to their necks in arranging Pearl Harbor. That is, arranging it as a U.S. defeat to weaken and embarrass Roosevelt. The concentration camp incarceration of the Japanese Americans is McCloy. The dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan is Stimson. Instead, this series seems to want to demonize General Leslie Groves. Sure, demonize him all you want, but he is working for Stimson. So the attempt to defend Stimson against McCulloch and other Truman biographers is grotesque. We don't need to defend these Wall Street figures. This gets us to the general question. Who is the enemy? What is wrong with American history? My answer is very clear. What's wrong with American history is the City of London and Wall Street. That's the enemy. This clarity is sadly lacking in this series. It's just not there. And therefore we're left with I don't know, problems. What do we conclude, really? What is the problem? Is the problem the American people? Is it human nature? Is it man's fate? Is it the Republican Party? What is it? It's the financiers. And again, it's simple. Fight bankers. If you're not fighting bankers, you're spinning your wheels. And that goes, you can project that back a long, long way. So Stimson and the imps of Satan, these are bad people. Another methodological problem. Is the U.S. presidency really a powerful office, or is the president usually a puppet? Let's take the case that occupies much of this series. Harry S. Truman. This is a puppet. He is one of the best documented puppets that we have. We have Clark Clifford telling us how Truman was manipulated, run on domestic policy, and between Dean Acheson especially and Averell Harriman, we learn how Truman was run in terms of international policy. It is not enough to blame this on Truman and then Jimmy Burns of South Carolina. You've also got to look at the control mechanisms, right? The Pendergast indictability of Truman, his past in the Ku Klux Klan. Somehow that doesn't come out. So Truman cannot be seen as an independent force. He is definitely a creature of these Wall Street forces, which this series is determined to defend. And the dropping of the atomic bomb, once again, is Stimson. He ran the project, and that is what Groves means when he says Truman just had to not interfere, and we went ahead and did it. Anti-Americanism, up to a point, fine. For the right reasons, it's okay. You need it. But what about when the United States does something good? For example, MacArthur in Japan. This is a tremendous step forward in history. The introduction of a land reform, the introduction of trade unions, the rights of women, the abolition of the House of Lords, the abolition of titled nobility, the renunciation of war as an instrument of policy. None of that seems to get involved. Roosevelt as the anti-fascist par excellence, attacking the Nazi dictator and fascism in the quarantine speech of Chicago, 1938. Not worth talking about. When Eisenhower blocks the British, the French, and the Israelis in the Suez Crisis of 1956, doesn't get in. How about Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program? The Soviets, of course, had the human sacrifices. It's really a matter of the Red Army and U.S. production. That's pretty much what won the war. So the honor, of course, goes to the Red Army and their human losses. But the Lend-Lease was indispensable, as the Soviets more or less admitted. So this doesn't get mentioned. We also have to remember that the Comintern policy of the 1920s, the so-called Third Period, the social fascist theory, was instrumental in bringing Hitler to power. Stalin had this theory of Hitler as the Liedekol, the icebreaker of the revolution, and seemed to welcome his seizure of power. Later on, there was the Hitler-Stalin Pact, but that, just like so many others, seems to be something you have to just sweep under the rug. The Atoms for Peace program by Eisenhower. The Atoms for Peace by Eisenhower is the way to world economic development, but our authors don't like it because it leads to nuclear proliferation. So those are some of the points. There's also the unfortunate fact that the series gives up on the Kennedy assassination and 9/11, the establishment official version of the Kennedy assassination and September 11th, 2001 is accepted. And I'm afraid what we're left with is some left liberals who don't have the guts to tell you who actually did these things, and therefore we fall back on some kind of collective guilt of the American people. Well, here we reject collective guilt, not for Germany, not for the U.S., not for anybody. It's wrong, and we'll see you again next week on World Crisis Radio.